Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. Very pleased to have you all show up this morning. This is going to be a very, very interesting morning, and I'm delighted you're going to have that experience. I've just had the privilege of spending a few minutes talking with President Lagos and with Senator Dodd, and it's been fascinating to, I know you're going to have a thrilling morning as you listen to them. And I want to say thank you to all of you for coming. Before we start, when we have public events like this with people that don't normally live here, work here, we start with a little safety announcement. Either I or Michael Matera are going to be responsible for your safety. He's sitting right down here, and so if there's a voice that comes and says we have to leave the building, just please follow our directions. This exit right here is the one that's closest to the stairs that'll take us down to the street level. We'll take two left-hand turns and a right. That'll take us over to the courtyard for National Geographic. There's a great show on right now about the Titanic, and we'll pay for everybody's ticket if we have to do that, but I think you'll enjoy it. Nothing's going to happen, but please do follow us if we have to do something. This is a remarkable opportunity we have this morning. I mentioned to President Lagos that the person who really pushed us to invite him here was Dr. Zbig Brzezinski, but unfortunately Zbig didn't live long enough for this moment when we could welcome the president. I think it was because President Lagos had been such a remarkable champion of democracy through the years. And I think that he said America needs this voice now, and I couldn't agree more. I'm delighted that he is willing to be with us today. He's going to challenge us, I think. He's going to give a real challenge. And I want to say thank you to you, Senator, for moderating this discussion. Senator Chris Dodd, for many years, was the leading advocate for Latin America in the Senate. He headed up the Latin American caucus and was a champion for America's relations with Latin America. And we miss that leadership, sir, but it's great that you're in Washington and you're continuing in this new venue, and you're all going to benefit from hearing his leadership today. So would you please, with your warm applause, welcome President Richard Lagos. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for this invitation. It's really my pleasure to be here this morning with all of you. Very good friends I see on the audience. And what I will try to address in this 20 minutes as an introduction is a rather unusual hypothesis that for the first time, the challenges that we have in the United States and Europe and what we have in Latin America are very much similar, in a sense that in both too many different areas of the world, there is a sense that democratic institutions are not working in the way that people would like to. And the economic challenges are very much similar, in a sense that in this country or in Europe, in this country particularly the American dream, many people think that is over. Or at least that in their families there is no American dream, because probably children are not going to be better off but worse off with regard to their parents. And something similar in Europe. Well, in the other way, in the case of Latin America, what we have had is that we learn how to defeat poverty. And the numbers, as we will see, are impressive. The point is that it's much more difficult to satisfy the rising expectation, and those people that used to be poor leave poverty behind them, and they feel that they were able to stand up. And now the society cannot be keeping the rising expectation. So, if this is the case, just a few figures, and I was challenged to do it in 20 minutes, but just to present the case. And of course, the first thing that I would like to do, but I will not have time for that, This is an epochal change. Technology has been such amazing producing new things that it's very difficult for me to get used to that. And therefore, what we have now is changes so rapidly that it's difficult to keep track on that. And let me tell you that given the web, internet, I think that the relationship used to be difficult and different from the past. Politics used to be a vertical situation. Leaders, political parties spoke. People will listen. Every 4 years they vote. That's it. Not anymore. Now it's an horizontal relation. I'm talking here. If this is going streaming, I don't want to see what Twitter's people will be telling me immediately. So this horizontality is normal. And the younger people, at least in my country, they don't tell me Mr. President. They don't tell me Don Ricardo. They tell me, hi Ricardo, how are you? It's quite a difference. And for them it's normal, you know? So this I mean for horizontal. And horizontal means that people between elections would like to be listened. So the problem is what kind of institutions will emerge in order to give some degree of participation to the people between elections, between this one and the other one. And at the same time, you cannot run the country through a plebiscite. But how are you going to be able to listen? And if you don't listen, they go walking to the square. All this means that the political institutions and the trust in the political institutions has been decreasing. And let me say the first graphic. Trust in political institutions. Needless to say that the lowest in political institutions is precisely in the European Union, and the best political institutions with regard to political parties, the police, the armed forces, the president, the prime minister, etc. And that means then that the lowest is in Latin American countries with regard to political institutions. They don't have in the case of European Union, because it's parliamentary system, they don't have the qualification about the president or prime minister. But in all the rest, what you have there is there. And needless to say that only with regard to political parties, the European Union performed worse than Latin America. But here then it's because I say there is a vertical relationship. Here is because it's that if they don't listen, they will go to the square. And here is where, if you add to this situation the question of money and politics and corruption, then you have a whole picture. And the question of corruption all over, and the influence of money and politics. And I don't need to elaborate that anymore, because all of you know perfectly well what I'm talking about. But the other point that I think is very important is the 2008 economic crisis, until what extent we have been able to leave behind us the crisis, or we are still in 1939 in the United States vis-a-vis the crisis of 1929. In 1939, you have a President Roosevelt just re-elected, but everybody will tell you that what really allowed to leave the crisis behind was the tremendous economic effort of this country to win the Second World War. If that really what finished the crisis was the economic effort of this country. And we still are not making a similar effort to leave behind the 2008 economic crisis. And this is why then, from the point of view, we have also the other point at the same time of this one of the economic crisis, which is what do we have here vis-a-vis the transformation of the the challenges from the economic point of view. And here we have the challenges because we have a huge transformation in the labor market and a huge transformation also vis-a-vis income equality and stagnation. Let's see that very quick. From the point of view of wages, this is very amazing. When you see there, you know, that up to 1975, productivity and wages were very much the same. After 75, and especially after 1980, you have a tremendous increase in productivity from 100 to 250 something, and then you have that increases in productivity doesn't reflect in hours compensation. The other way of looking to these changes in this part of the world is what you have here. The new economy of the United States, just from 1996 to 2014. So in the last 20 years, if you allow me to say that, what you have had, that the origin of the real billionaires in America that used to be a majority of 53% in 96, because the new technologies and the new wealth that has been created, now you have something extremely different. Only 30% of billionaires today are not self-made men, but it was inherited from somebody. And all this is also some sort of income stagnation. What percentage of houses have had flat or decreasing income between the last 10 years? And here, what you have is another way of looking. You have Italy, about Italy in about 92%. You have the US and UK, the US about 80%, the UK about 70%. In short, France, 60-something%. And of course, Sweden, all which you have in Scandinavian, is only 27%. But the average of the 25 countries, the most developed ones, well, flat or decreasing income is, the average is beyond 60%. The other way of observing this is a chart that I like very much. The end of the American dream. Likelihood of having better incomes than your parents. And the answer, the correct answer is, that depends the year that you were born. If you were born in 1940, or before that, my case, well, in that case, it's about 92% will have better incomes. And if you were born in 1950, it's 79%. If you were born in 1960, it's 62%. 1970, 61. And if you are a millennial, being born in 1980, 50%. And this, I think, is very clear, and I don't need to elaborate anymore. The following picture, the following chart that we have here, well, it belongs to Mr. Piketty. And I don't think that Mr. Piketty is very popular in America, so we can leave behind that. But it's very clear that the upper 50% of the population is going down. The participation was in 62, 20%, and it's coming down to about 12, and vice versa with regard to the top 1%. So much for the rich world. Let's go to the other part of the world. And the other part of the world, I like very much the 4 speeds that the world used to have. Let me explain. The OECD Development Center in 2011 decided to have a division of the speed of the world, and the speed was the high-income countries. And the high income was, of course, United States, Canada, almost all the European Union, the old European Union, and that's it, and Australia, of course. Then you have the poor countries, which is the blue, and it's Africa mainly, India, etc. And then they have the convergent. Who are convergent? Convergent are those countries that has a per capita income growing at twice or more of the high-income countries. And are convergent because if you are growing more than double the per capita income, you are going to converge in the future with the most rich countries. And the only countries during the 90s, that are in red is China. In Latin America, only Chile and Trinidad Tobago because of oil. And look what happened with the world in the first decade of the 21st century. How about that? Amazing, don't you think so? Look, 1990, and the first 10 years of 2010, incredible. All Latin American countries, with the exception of, well, Venezuela. But all those countries were able to converge in the sense that they increase. Some Central American you have there, and that's it. Mexico couldn't make it, and Mexico is just fighting. Who are fighting? Fighting are those countries that has a bigger rate of growth in per capita income vis-a-vis the rich countries, high-income countries, but it's not enough to double or more. They are fighting, but they are not convergent. You see the difference? And it's amazing then to have these two pictures, because the two pictures will explain you why. Well, most Latin American countries are performing in such a way that you will have a very important growth in terms of P per capita. And in terms of P per capita, well, what you have there, real figures is to 2016, Argentina 20,000, Brazil 15, Chile 24, Colombia, etc., etc. Therefore, the amount of this purchasing power parity is that either we are above the 20,000 or we are going to be above 20,000. And this explains what I was telling at the beginning. This explains that what you have here is, poverty and indigence. Because here, what you have is, on the average, Latin American region as such, 44% in 2002 were living under the poverty line, to 28 in 2040. Look, from 44 to 28. So you have more than 15% of the total population living poverty behind. And indigency from almost 20 to 11. And then I took some particular countries. Brazil, on 2004, let's say 37%, 39% to 16. Colombia, 47, 28. Mexico, very unusual, but this is because the crisis and the relationship with the American economy, and then Peru. I can add the case of Chile, which is very much the same. Another country like Ecuador. Ecuador is very remarkable. From 2000, from 1990, in the case of Ecuador, from 2000, the poverty was 60%. In 2016, was only 30. 30% in the case of Ecuador. And this explains probably why, and this is the final one, this explains probably why optimism in Latin America, young people living in your country are going to live better or worse off than your parents. And here you have then that the Latin American countries are the more optimistic of all of them, followed by Africa, by Asia Pacific, the Middle East, and the less optimistic are United States and Europe. And therefore, I could say that here we have something very interesting in terms of, can you explain then why you are optimistic and the other not? Until what extent then that explain the difference between one country and the other? And just to have a curiosity, I would like to present this shares in percentage according to UN median fertility variance projection. That the demographic says that in today's world, we are going to be Europe, 22% of the total population in 2050. And Europe, you will see how it's going down to 11 in 2010, to 8 in 2050, and to 6 in next century. And this means that Asian, needless to say, is going to be the largest population all over the world, but after 2050, because of Africa, then if you add Africa to Latin American and North America and Europe, will be the largest population in the world. Interesting, because now all of us are so much concentrated what's going in Asia, but the trends of the population in the long run, therefore, you can go back from the Pacific to the Atlantic if you consider that Africa belongs to the Atlantic. But that just to think very much in the near future. In short, what I'm trying to say is this: look, the problem that we have now in the region is how we're going to be able to solve the issues on the political sphere and in the economic sphere. And those solving of those issues, well, what is behind this? Globalization is wonderful, because thanks to globalization, all our economy has been able to have growth. The only problem is that within society and inside societies, there are some people that perform better and others perform, they are winners and losers. And what kind of public policies are we going to have with regard to those that are losers? Losers in terms of between nations, or losers inside a particular society. And most of the public policies that we know, how to defeat poverty, well, it was okay for the agenda of the 1990s or the 2000s, but not for the 2020. And the big issue is, what are going to be then if we wanted to recover again in those values that democracy is able to deliver? The feeling in many countries is that democracy has not been able to deliver the goods and services that they would like to have. And therefore, I'm against the political institutions, I'm against the elite, I'm against Washington. And this speech is making in Europe, in Latin America, and in the United States. And what really worries me is that if political institutions are in doubt, then what kind of democracy we are going to have with regard to the future. until what extent Madeleine Albright's title of her last book is a reminder of where we are. And in this country and in this institution, I just think that the US was important because the power of your example through the 2 and something centuries since you were born independent, and not the example of your power, which is different. And therefore, I would say that what we have today is a very difficult situation from democracy. And these political factors and these economic and social factors are behind this sense of deterioration in the way that we are able to live in a civilized world. And therefore, in today's discussion, I think that this is what is at the center of our problems. And why I think that they're very interesting, because probably for the first time, we may have a common agenda with regard to these issues in the North and in the South. And if we have a common agenda, probably we'll have a discussion because of those middle classes that are going down, and the other part of the world, those middle classes that are going up. But in both worlds, those middle classes are not satisfied. And therefore, they don't trust in political institutions, and they don't like the economic picture that I described. If this is the case, probably institutions like the center that has been so influential, probably also we may came from Latin America to find the right answers here in this building. Thank you very much for the invitation.
How about another round of applause for President Lagos for that presentation this morning? Very good. Mr. President, first let me thank John Hamre and Michael Matera as well, the director of the Americas Division, Mark Schneider, a good friend as well, for organizing this event today. And Mr. President, let me just say, for my perspective, as someone who was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic many, many years ago, and chaired the committee on the Western Hemisphere of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or was the ranking Democrat for many years. It's no exaggeration to say that President Ricardo Lagos is one of the great, great heroes, not just of this hemisphere of the Americas, but globally, as a fighter and a clear thinker when it comes to the issue of democratic institutions. And it's truly a great honor to be with you today, and I thank you immensely for your work. And it was helpful, I think, in making a nice transition for our conversation here briefly, and talking about the economic issues and the political institutions, and whether or not the nations of the world are going to be able to accommodate these changes that are occurring. And I was thinking on the way over, there's a new book, relatively new book, called How Democracies Die. A couple of very good professors at Harvard University have written about it, and it's a sort of interesting analogy, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. They point out that during the Cold War, 3 out of every 4 nations that went through significant changes did so because of a coup, a military coup or coercion. And obviously, I'm preaching to the choir and talking to you about this, because obviously one of the examples was in Chile in 1973. But there are many other examples as well where that occurred. But lately, as the authors of the book point out, the changes are occurring, and democracy seems to be suffering at the hands of elected leaders, not people who took over by force, but rather were popularly elected in their countries, and then have begun the process of denigrating the institutions, the judiciary, the press, the normal political institutions of a country. And so examples of that, clearly Venezuela, Nicaragua, what's happening in Europe and many countries as well. And many in the audience, I'm sure, can add to that list. And some more exaggerated examples than others, but nonetheless, there seems to be a clear pattern here, and a very troublesome pattern, particularly if someone like yourself has been such a champion of democratic institutions. How do we turn this around, if at all? First of all, do you agree with that analysis? And secondly, What observations do you bring, particularly this in Latin America? We could talk in a minute about Venezuela and Nicaragua specifically, what's going on, but I wonder if you could share with us your own thoughts about whether or not you agree with that analysis, and two, what steps we might be taking to turn that around in a different direction.
Well, I think that, first of all, let me tell you, it's for me an honor to be talking with Senator Dodd, and the way that he was so much involved in issues about the Western Hemisphere during, well, 30 years in Congress is...
Long time, too long.
Anyhow, well, that we have in common, long time doing. But let me put this way. I think it's correct what you mentioned, that because you have these challenges that I have mentioned, populism means if it's a shortcut, and people at the beginning found a shortcut. Printing money, for instance, is so easy, instead of... I used to have a discussion with President Chavez and say, Hugo, the difference between you and me, if you want to defeat poverty, you write a check, because plenty of money coming from oil. I don't have a check. I need to have growth first, and then to think how much of that growth will go for distribution. Not all, because you have to invest also. That's the difference. And the question is that those people that you describe, well, printing money. It's something interesting to discover. Correa, the former president of Ecuador, never dared to touch the question of dollars. And you know, it was before him that the decision was for the former president not to print money, to say, from now on, we are going to use only the American money, period. And therefore, they don't have anything like the central bank. But I think that is correct, those people, that ones that are elected, the temptation to go for the easy road of printing money and to have an inflation of 40,000 something percent like Venezuela today.
Yeah.
And therefore, you end up being a failed state. And this is really what's going on in many cases. And this is why I do believe that political institutions are unable to cope that, and people then has no confidence in political institutions. And this is what I say, people would like to be listened. Please, sir, you have to listen me, sir. And if you don't listen, then a demagogue may have the solution.
Well, how do you explain, in a sense, in putting aside the obvious political events that occurred in Chile, even Uruguay for that matter, and other countries, there's certain countries in Latin America that seem to have center-left, center-right governments. They move back and forth, but the political institutions of democracy seems consistent, speaking more recently in time. And then there are others where, despite the fact of having those kind of democratic moments and so forth, it seems to collapse, unfortunately, very quickly. What is it about Chile or an Uruguay or a Costa Rica, for instance, Panama, that allows a consistency of democracy even when the political winds move in different directions? What's different about these countries than others where it seem to have the difficulty of doing that?
Well, I guess that those three countries that you mentioned have had the political institutions much more stable in the past. So the big discussion that we used to have in Chile, how are you going to defeat dictatorship? Through the arms or voting in a plebiscite? Right. And we end up, although the typical discussion, well, at the end, everybody agree. Even those that were in the process of fighting Pinochet with arms, they decided just to go to vote. Yeah. And it seemed to me that it's because there is some previous relationship with that. And my impression is that what we have in some other countries is that people don't have that tradition. I mean, the rule of law. Right. The other point that I guess is important is to understand that democracy is a very delicate political system that you have to water every day to keep them growing. and you go step by step. Revolution doesn't take place at once. You go to take the Bastille in Paris just once every century, but no more than that, you see. and it seems to me that many people or the leaders are not able to explain that it's a gradual evolution, the real progress.
Yeah.
And sometimes, depending on economic circumstances, probably it's going to be not as fast as people would like to. And how are you going to be able to do that? And how are you going to explain that? Now, of course, it's true. You can have some economic ideas or policies. In Chile, copper prices are extremely important. And needless to say, I had to run the country at the beginning, copper prices going down, and then I decided, well, if it is possible to think long-term copper prices, so that the copper prices were going down, I'm going to spend more, because the long term is going to be higher. And I explained this. And the guys in Wall Street believed me, fortunately. And the real issue was when the copper price went up, and I couldn't spend as much as I wanted, because the long term was lower. So I was able to have a countercyclical economic policy. When the economy was going down, I can spend more. When the economy was going up, I had to spend less. 2008 arrived, and my successor, Madame Bachelet, had saved 40% of our GDP because of that policy. So he only took 4% of the 40% to make the economy working again.
Yeah.
So you can have some kind of policies in order to be able to make progress, but it's not easy to explain at that moment.
Yeah. Let me go back and you said something I thought very, very interesting in your comments, and you were talking about the role of the United States, and particularly the moral authority in the post-World War II period. The establishment of international institutions, the various conventions dealing with things like chemical weapons, biological weapons, recently landmines and sort of thing. There was a real network. From a personal standpoint, my father was the executive trial counsel at the Nuremberg trials, 1945 and 46, and felt very proud to have been a part of a generation that in the wake of that casualty, of the tragedy rather, of World War II, they were able to build these international organizations which would contribute to a global peace and security. And arguably, the last 70 years, with obvious examples to the contrary, there's been a relatively, in terms of peace, global peace. What role do you think the value of that has played? What role does the United States need to play today, given the fact that we authored an awful lot of it? And do you agree necessarily that you're watching the casualties of what's going on politically in terms of democracy are these very institutions that were created to bring that kind of stability around?
Well, I think that the role of the U.S., particularly after the Second World War, has been so important in a sense of was able to build a way to understand how a world that is going to be much more globalized will require some kind of multilateral institutions. I wouldn't say to run the world, but I would say to establish some rules. According to those rules, everybody after the Second World War say we have a democratic country, even though it was not very democratic, but nobody dared to say I'm against democracy. They have a different discussion what democracy is, but democracy was a very good word. If you're a dictator, well, you are out of the club. The point is that the way that we are building those institutions, then you have the Cold War. If you have the Cold War, then you have the European Union. And the European Union, the idea was, well, to be listened at the world stage, speaking with one voice. When Henry Kissinger say, where is the phone in Europe? Well, finally, the Europeans had a phone to call. Today it's a little bit difficult, no? And it's a little bit difficult, why? Precisely because those countries like Hungary, Poland, Austria, are going in such a way that is reminded of those, what happened in those countries, 50 or 60 years ago.
Right.
Yeah? And this is why I'm so worried about, and what's going on now in Italy, it's really a very difficult issue. Mm-hmm. And if this is the case, then you could say that probably because political institutions are in question, many parts of the establishment is being taken to a new criticism.
Yeah.
And my problem is that, and I like the title of the economist, as I mentioned before, that say that present at the distraction with regard to what is American foreign policy today. Wow. Thinking in terms of the famous memoir of Dean Acheson, when he wrote the title of Present at the Creation of the New World, the world of right after the Second World War. And that creation was the values of the American ideas and the founding fathers of this country. Mm. The rule of law at the international level. And when you are in a small country like Chile, well, for us it's very important, the rule of law. Because otherwise, who is going to respect you? If only the power of the real power, is going to play. No. And therefore, it seems to me that what we have now is a very difficult situation because the values of a democracy, the rule of law, doesn't exist anymore. If you have the World Trade Organization and WTO rules are not respected anymore, and you can have tariffs 25% no matter what you say, well, what kind of world is emerging? And the answer from China saying, now we have to be together with the European Union in order to go to WTO and complain. My goodness, would you say that? So the Chinese together with the Europeans vis-a-vis what the United States is doing? I don't understand this world. And this kind of expression, present at the distraction, is because a world that has been built and we were used to believe in those rules. I had a very difficult moment when Chile was part of the Security Council and had to say no to the invasion in Iraq. And when the president asked me if I was willing to go to war without the Security Council, I explained them, Mr. President, we are in a small country. The decision to go to war or not belongs to the Security Council. And I cannot do anything outside the Security Council. I was to reinforce the multilateral decisions at the institution that we have created. And when 9 months later, that same Security Council asked to send troops to Haiti, well, we sent troops to Haiti in 72 hours. Mm-hmm. And the president was kind enough to call me and say thanks. I say, no, Mr. President, please don't say thanks. It's just to be coherent with what I told you 9 months ago when I say no. I mean, this is the essential of the world that was established. And now apparently that world is in trouble.
Let me get a little more local in the region, if I can, a little bit. First, I was struck in preparing to talk to you today. If you asked anyone in this audience today, what does 9/11 signify? Everyone can tell you exactly where they were on that day in 2001. But looking back, the date 9/11 has a lot more significance, I think, for you. For it was 9/11, 1973, that General Pinochet took over in Chile and destroyed the Allende government. It was 9/11 in 2001 when Colin Powell was on a plane flying to Lima, Peru, to be a part of the creation of a Inter-American Democratic Charter.
That's right.
And so 18 years from the very day of the coup d'etat in Chile, you established this organization within the American countries to deal with preventing the kind of chaos that when democracies are in crisis or being threatened. In fact, that's almost the exact language of the charter. Take me to Venezuela today, and what's happened to the charter in a sense. Venezuela would seem to strike me as a classic example of a failed state, of a dictatorship. You have some 2 million people have now emigrated to Brazil or to Colombia. Does the Inter-American Democratic Charter, is it at work? And if so, why isn't it engaged in an example like Venezuela?
Well, I think and I hope that it's going to be possible to take a very strong decisions at the inter-American institutions vis-a-vis what's going on in Venezuela, because in Venezuela now there is not a democracy anymore. It's true. It's true. President Maduro was elected in a democratic way. Let's accept that in 2013 was also elected in a democratic way. But please don't forget that in 2015 was also democratically elected a National Assembly with a huge majority for the opposition. And what they did, they established a new constitutional assembly created out of nothing, without respect for the Venezuelan constitutions. And without the constitutional assembly, they, in practical terms, abolish the legitimate powers of the National Assembly. That's why I say this is not a question between the opposition and the government. This is a question between a legislative power democratically elected in 2015, and this has been rejected by the government, de facto. So in that moment, the government is not democratic anymore. And I think that it's essential for democratic institutions to be able to fulfill the charter and say, please, you have to go ahead. Now, if that is part of the equation, the other part is that the opposition has been unable to present just one common front. And I think that it's necessary that they understand that this is not the time to discuss who is going to be the future president of Venezuela after Maduro. This is the time to discuss everybody together to get rid of Maduro. And then is the moment of thinking in what is better for Venezuela and not what is better for me. And I have been also very explicit to tell this to the democratic opposition to President Maduro. Because this is also the other part of the equation. The political vacuum, as we said before, doesn't exist. And therefore, if you get rid of Maduro, then what? Well, we have to find a way by which is going to be an interim government established according to the rules of the majority of the population. And if you add the question of Venezuela, in the horizon, now we have a very clear the other point, which is Nicaragua. And it's exactly the same case, you know. Somebody that was elected, 1, 2, 3, 4, and here where we are. And what happened yesterday, is very difficult to think about, you know? When the representative of the Pope with the bishop or the cardinal went to a church because some people was there, and some paramilitaries are there, and well, then after that, what can be done? No?
But the world spoke out, and when very kind of social movement you're seeing in Nicaragua today, that brought the downfall of President Somoza. The world spoke out. The United States and other countries were very active in that, if not directly, but certainly rhetorically being very supportive of the change. Today it seems to be there's an awful lot of silence. There have been over, some 350 people have lost their lives in Nicaragua. I I don't hear people talking about steps that might be taken by the OAS, the UN, the diaspora, and so forth, others, to really make a difference. Why today is it we're not speaking up more about this?
Well, I think that to some extent in the case of Venezuela, it's because the Caribbean country has been rather reluctant to take some action, especially because they have received some oil in the past.
Yeah.
So it's not very interesting, this definition. But nevertheless, I think that now probably is going to be taking some action. Okay. Otherwise, that democratic charter will mean nothing. Oh, yeah. And this would be a tremendous mistake, you know. Yeah. And the fact, you know, at the same time, I would say that the worst thing that can be done is to take some strong actions or military actions by a very important country in the world. That would be terrible. And all of us will say no in Latin America in advance. This is a problem that we have, and we will see how to solve it. And this is why you are entitled to say, I ask you to respect the democratic charter. Yeah. And we are unable to do, then I remember many years ago, President Uribe at that time in Colombia said that they were having a lot of problems trying to defeat the guerrillas. And I say at that time, President Uribe, I think that if you need military aid, we are ready to give you a major instructions. Yeah. Because we cannot be in a position like Kosovo, when at the very end the Europeans were unable to solve the issue of Kosovo, and was United States that has to solve the issue of Kosovo. Yeah. And I would like that we in Latin America are going to be able to solve our own problems without somebody else, like in Kosovo, coming to the region. Yeah. And this, I think, is very important if we wanted to believe that we, Latin Americans, can solve our own problems. Yeah. And this, I think, sometimes means that you have to take difficult questions. In that occasion, when I say this to President Uribe, I'm going to tell you this, Hugo Chavez made a very strong intervention, saying that never the Venezuelan army was going to be abroad, because the Venezuelan army was only to defend the soil of Venezuela. And I couldn't resist and say, Chavez, fortunately, Simón Bolívar didn't think the way that you are thinking now, because thanks to Bolívar, they went out of Venezuela to Colombia, to Ecuador, to Peru, and thanks to that, then finally we were liberated. Yeah. I'm so glad that Bolívar thought different from you. Never forgive Hugo Chavez.
Since you mentioned President Uribe, and obviously President Santos and the agreements, Chile was an observer in Havana for the agreement that was struck ending the 4 decades revolution group, the guerrillas FARC. I don't know if you've talked to Iván Duque, the new president of Colombia, and if you have, or if you're planning to, what advice would you give him? Because there's a lot of talk of whether or not you might undermine the very success that President Santos had, and given the opposition that President Uribe had to those negotiations. What advice would you give the new president?
It's my impression that there has been a lot of discussion with the kind of justicia, how you say, transitional justice. Mm-hmm. And transitional justice is part of reality if you want to solve a long-standing issue like the guerrillas in Venezuela. And I think that it speaks very well of President Santos to decide to take the decision to go through that way. I remember at the beginning when he mentioned the idea of a transitional justice, there was a lot of discussions. But at the very end, it's part of reality of today's world. I mean, you and me has to sign the peace agreement. But you know that after you finalize that, you are going to be in prison because you torture. and I'm going to be in prison because I kidnapped. Well, it's very difficult that you and me are going to sign that. And to have then transitional justice is how we're going to be dealing with those crimes, because are crimes, in a way that at the same time is able to solve the questions. And I think that it was not an easy solution. Chile was part of those that were going with the process, and we follow all the system, all the process, and all the negotiations. And finally, I think that I believe that the new president in Colombia probably will try to make some small adjustments, but the whole agreement is not going to be in jeopardy.
That's good to hear.
That's my impression, really, and I think that even though the elections in Colombia was rather polarized between two extremes, nobody was in the center.
Yeah.
Allow me to put that way. But nevertheless, I think that now that you are elected, then normally you tend to go, if you are from the extreme right, to go to the center. If you are from the extreme, go to the center, simply because you would like to have long-term decisions in a country.
Yeah.
A policy that is broad enough in order to remain on time and not depend on who is in power from 4 years to 4 years.
Yeah. I'm jumping around on you, but we have limited amount of time, so a couple more questions quickly. The immigration issue is a big issue, not just here, it's a global issue. The massive migrations of people for climate change reasons or other problems politically, economically. You mentioned the good news in Latin America economically, but I couldn't help but thinking about places like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. Many of the reasons that people are migrating from those countries, there's a certain amount of violence going on, but also the lack of economic opportunity, a tremendous amount of inequality. The United States is talking, as we all know, about building walls, denying asylum to people, separating families. I hear very little conversation about what might be done to provide some incentives for people to make the decision to stay home rather than leave. Most of them don't want to leave the country they were born in. They're doing so for very dramatic reasons. But I don't hear a lot of conversation about what might be done. How do the countries of Latin America, the strong countries of Latin America, not just the United States, but strong countries, make a difference and help out so you eliminate at least part of the argument of why people feel they have to move and leave?
Well, I think that it's important with regard to this issue of migration to understand a little bit about history. This country was made for those people that came here. And the first one that came here was because of religion. Religion. How many are living because of some religious issues in today's world with regard to Europe? Number two, European countries, during the 19th century, European countries expelled about 2 million people at the time when the world was no more than 500 million. You know, in a country with that kind of population, expelled 2 million is quite a number. And those who are expelled where? Either to this country or to Latin America. And now they say, no, I don't want to receive nobody. Human beings has been migrants since the human being exists on this planet. And they used to say that the first human beings were from Africa, and they migrate. Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican novelist, used to say, in Latin America, all of us are migrants. The first one arrived about 20,000 years ago, or 30,000, and nobody in this land was asking for the passport, because there was nobody to ask for a passport. And another migrant arrived 500 years later from Spain or Portugal, and some other Afro-Americans arrived 300 years ago. So all of us are migrants. If this is the case, then I would say, first, the question of migration cannot be a question of domestic policy issue of any country, no matter how important is that country. The question of migration has to be part of the international agenda. How are we going to deal with that? Why? Because it's not possible to live in a globalized world where everything is globalized. Goods, services, money, click, and billions of dollars go from here to there. Everything can move, with the only exception of the human being. Don't you think that it's very difficult to live in a world where the only thing that cannot move from country to country? And this is not a question of south to north. It's also a question south to south. I will say something not in the right words probably. The only Negroes that we knew in Chile was Pelé. And now we have received 70,000 people coming from Haiti. Now we are receiving quite a number of people coming from Venezuela, and thanks to that, we are able to have our hospitals working because quite a number are physicians. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the question of migration is a question that all of us have to deal with. And it seems for me very difficult to understand that this country that was the melting pot of so many different cultures, and you have been able to incorporate and to keep some particular, this the Italian, the Polish, what to say about the people coming from Ireland, etc. Well, O'Higgins.
I got to just tell you, I didn't use this. In politics, you always make a connection where you can. My grandmother's last name was O'Higgins. And for those of you who know the history of Chile, when I was in Chile one time, a banner headline, Senator Dodd related to Bernardo O'Higgins.
But you were welcome in Chile, not only for that, but because of what you have been doing before, the Chileans learning that you had O'Higgins in your ancestors. No, but I say, really, I think that how is possible to have a huge convention with regard to the issue of migration? Yeah. Because what we have seen here now, those people coming from Honduras, Guatemala, etc., and they use Mexico just across to reach the promised land. And if you are the promised land, then you have to behave like what kind of promise your leaders are going to say with regard to this issue. And I think that is extremely unfair what is going on now with regard to this issue in this country. Mm-hmm. And the question to separate is very difficult. It's very difficult to understand.
We could have made this topic a conversation all day. Border security is important to people. It's a major political issue. I happen to believe that Brexit, the outcome, was largely determined because people appealed to some of the worst instincts on immigration issues and so forth. So there are other examples of it. This has been a wonderful conversation. We've got a few folks in the audience. Mark Schneider is here. Mark, you had a question I think you wanted to raise?
Thank you. I think everybody can hear me. Mr. President, Senator, you talked about the threats that you see to democratic institutions, and you talked a bit about the economic changing status of the middle class. One thing that you mentioned in passing, but I'd like to have your thoughts about it, is to what degree, when you look at the region and beyond the region, that the threats to democracy come from corruption internally, in political parties and in the institutions, and the inability to effectively deal with that problem?
Well, I think that the question of corruption is becoming more and more important in terms of how you're going to be able to deal with that in a very concrete way. I would like to say something that probably is not politically correct. But I would like to say that politics is for the human beings. And human beings are people that can think about. Why I say this? Because I don't think that firms, companies, can also participate in politics with money. In Chile, we have the experience in 2003, that was the first time that we decided to have some public money for campaigns. And I had two differences with the opposition party of that time. The first one was that it was not considered to finance primaries, and they considered only to finance one that the candidate was registered officially by the party. And I say, but look, I was elected in my coalition in a primary on a voluntary basis, and then just spend money. So I think that wasn't taken into account. And the second one was to say that private firms can contribute up to 3% of their profits for political campaigns. And I say, this is not correct. The owners of those firms, those that receive the benefit, the profits, they pay taxes and they can contribute as a person, as a human being. But what is the political idea of a particular company? I don't agree with that. At the end, in order to get the public money, I had to accept both things, not to finance primaries and that the public, that the companies can provide money. In the last 2 years, a new corruption problems emerged with campaign financing in Chile. A new legislation was approved. In this new one, primaries were included, financing political parties were included, and there was a prohibition for private companies to make contributions. It took 10 years to discover and I think that now that this has been progress. The question is, are we going to be able to have a very strong punishment for the cases of corruption, especially when it's not only for finance political campaigns, but some cases go to the private pocket of somebody.
Yeah.
And I think that both things are corruption, and those things have to be penalized very strongly. I note also that this is part of the culture of particular countries. And we used to be very proud of that, not now anymore, for issues that have taken place in my country. But if you don't react as a society, then it's going to be very difficult to succeed. And the question then of corruption is becoming more and more important. I know that there is a very difficult case with regard to somebody like President Lula. I know President Lula. I don't think that he has used for the power to get rich. I remember once I asked President Lula, what are you planning to do when you retire? And he said, well, I would like to go to have a beer with the members of the trade unions where I was born as a leader. And I hope that they will tell me, welcome.
Well,
And I believe it. So for me, it's very difficult what's going on there, because if he still has such a popularity, what is going to be the democracy in Brazil in the future? How are they going to be able to combine corruption with in such a way that it's not used as an excuse, so that somebody that has that kind of leadership is going to be forbidden? Now, no matter how important you are a leader, if you are corrupted, you have to be punished.
Yeah.
That's very clear. Yeah.
you know, I want to just a quick question about López Obrador in Mexico, the president-elect. Do you know him?
Well, I met him in more protocol visit. He was the mayor of Mexico, the District of Mexico. He was very successful at that time. All what I can say is that at least when he was mayor, first of all, he decided to revitalize the historical downtown Mexico.
Right.
And to do that, he decided to have a joint venture with the private sector, and he decided that Carlos Slim was going to be a good partner to do that. The fact is that partner Slim wrote to that, and 5 years after that, I went to a Sheraton that was opened in the middle of the historical part as part of the renovation of that.
Right.
So what I'm trying to say is that López Obrador at that moment, was very pragmatic to see how can I recover,
Yeah.
Well, what you have done here in Washington, so many areas that used to be very bad areas are being recovered in such a wonderful way. Well, this is what he tried to do in downtown Mexico City and was successful. I think that, let's hope that he is going to be as pragmatic as when he was mayor, now that he has the responsibility, because needless to say, he is going to be the most powerful president simply because he will have majority in both houses.
Carlos
And
Slim.
that was very unusual because the old system, the president was elected with 35% of the vote,
Right.
and the other 2/3 were against the president that you elected. But this for the first time, he got 53% of the vote.
Yeah.
So he is going to be quite independent of Congress because he will have majority in both houses, and his responsibility is going to be very big.
But just when you're telling the story about Carlos Slim and the city of Mexico, if I were Carlos Slim, I'd be nervous today based on what you just told us. Let me turn to Michael Matera, the director of the Americas Program. Michael, any question you may have?
Thank you very much, Senator Dodd. First, President Lagos, thank you very much for sharing some of your time on this family vacation to Washington. We're very pleased and honored to have you here for a couple of hours. In terms of what you've just said in response to Mark on corruption, I think we have a lot in this country to learn from Chile on what you've done in terms of political party finance and campaign finance. And I think Chile really is a model that a lot of countries can look to, and particularly our own. So that we congratulate Chile for what it has done, the model that it is playing in that respect. On the issue of Venezuela, I wanted to drill down a little bit more. I wanted to hear a little bit more from you as to how you think the international community, in particular the region, can have more of an impact. A year ago, none of us thought that Maduro would last to this point. At this time, it looks like Venezuela may become another Cuba. Is there anything that the region can do? I certainly agree with you on the question of military intervention. It's something, particularly if it comes from this side of the continent, it would be completely counterproductive. But is there any argument that might be made at some point for humanitarian intervention in a country where there are tens of thousands of children who are dying each year because of the lack of medicines, the lack of medical care? Humanitarian intervention is not an easy issue, and what happened in Libya has complicated it much more. But is there, do you think, an argument for humanitarian intervention at any point, and what other suggestions do you have on international intervention of some sort?
Well, I think that the responsibility to protect somebody, sometimes you have to think about. And the humanitarian issue, I think that is on the table already, in a sense that both sides agree in not to agree. Because if you go there by humanitarian reasons and want to send some goods or some services, this is going to be rejected by President Maduro. And he said that this is the way that, etc., etc. And he not want to recognize the issue that there is an humanitarian crisis. As you say, with regard to kids, Well, it's normally a new baby that has been born. After 4 months, the chances of being die is extremely high. As soon as the mother has no milk anymore, the children will die. Maduro's solution was to forbid publications on infant mortality rate. The statistics are not available anymore, but all of us know that normally mothers has no milk anymore because they have nothing to eat after 4 months. And the number of babies dying after 4 months of being born is amazing. So the world was so much impact for what happened in the cave in Thailand.
Yeah.
And that is the nice part of human beings and mankind, you know, to be, because what happened with those kids.
Yeah.
And everybody was happy when we discovered that the 11 kids plus the coach were alive. But this that happened every day in Venezuela.
Yeah.
So there has been some talk about some kind of humanitarian intervention. Until what extent the governments are going to be trying to think or to see the other side and not to recognize what is the real issue. I think that there is an humanitarian need to act in Venezuela now.
Yeah. Let me pick up
my
on
impression is that the government, the so-called the Lima group
right.
of the major countries in the region, I think that they are going to do something.
Let me picking up on Michael's question. Obviously, going back to the Lima group, the Inter-American Charter, Democratic Charter. It was agreed to many years ago. When the OAS had been voting on these issues, there were 20 nations that voted to do something about Venezuela, of the 34 nations. But under the OAS, it's one nation, one vote. So there wasn't the kind of vote necessary to actually make a decision. Yet of the 20 nations who noted to do something about Venezuela, they represented 90% of the population of the OAS nations. So if you would, just briefly, it looks to me like something about the charter of the OAS, if you're going to be able to have the agreement, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, then you've got to be able to do something. And if it could be defeated that easily for reasons that had less to do with Venezuela and more to do with economic petrodollars and so forth, what suggestions would you have to make the organization more vibrant and be able to be responsive to the Inter-American Democratic Charter?
I think that the political solution is to be much more open to the Caribbean countries.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, this is the practical thing that we have, you know, and I would say it's part of people from the Southern Cone. We are so far from the Caribbean countries. When you go to a Caribbean country, they will listen to you because you have nothing concrete. You have no vested interest in the Caribbean countries. And it's different if you are closer to the Caribbean countries. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And therefore, I think that for the Southern Cone, I was happy to learn that the President of Chile, President Piñera, was invited and went to the last meeting last week in Jamaica.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that this issue was presented. Okay. But that's at the beginning to find a political solution.
Yeah, I understand that. We can carry on this conversation for some time. Does someone else in the audience have questions here? Yeah, just, I'm sorry, what is it? Oh, where's Doctor? Oh, Doctor, yeah. Please go ahead. On the microphone.
President Lagos, good morning. I wanted to go back to the issue of trade. I remember in Mar del Plata, when the discussions got very tough, and I remember you saying the issue of trade and Mar del Plata. I remember when the discussions got very, very tough on that issue, you said, I don't know about you, I remember your sentence, but I live in a country with very few people, 15 million, and the only way to create growth for my country is to open up and go for international trade and trade agreements. What do you think of the situation now? And you just mentioned a little bit about China and the European Union and what can be done.
Well, I remember very well Mar del Plata at that time. And that was when, in that meeting, in practical terms, the idea of a free trade of the America was not feasible anymore because of some particular countries. And they were very much against, like the host country at that time. And I remember that President Bush was not particularly happy after that meeting, and with all the reasons for him. But the fact is that, and the question that you mentioned is quite relevant. In our case, 96% of our international trade is under a free trade agreement. And to have a free trade with a bilateral basis, country to country, that means that one part cannot say this is not valid anymore and I will rise unilaterally. And this is going to be a big issue, because if a particular country we have trade agreement would like to raise tariff unilaterally, we will say you are not entitled to do that, because that's the reason of a trade agreement, a bilateral one. Mm-hmm. So in the case of the United States, well, it's a bilateral agreement. And therefore, you cannot unilaterally produce an effect like the one that today the US is doing with some of the countries like Mexico, Canada, or the Europeans, or China. And that's the reason probably why China is saying to the Europeans, let's work together, the issue. And number two, I would say, is another thing that when you have multilateral free trade agreements, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that now has a different name. And in that case, you know, in that agreement, the idea was to have some changes vis-a-vis the old agreement that we have. And this is going to be a very peculiar issue with regard to the future, because nobody thought that was possible unilaterally to change the terms of a particular agreement. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, yes, Mr. Ambassador. How are you, Mr. Ambassador? Nice to see you. Yeah.
The mic.
I'm Timothy Towell, retired State Department official. All of it, 30 years, starting in the Kennedy administration, all of it in this hemisphere, pretty much. All dictatorships in the 20th century, and I still follow things closely. And I took a lot of notes, Mr. President. It was superb. And you talked about Venezuela, which I follow carefully. And you said you'd say no in advance for any naughty kind of stuff to get rid of the bus driver. What if you didn't know in advance what was going to happen to the bus driver, to the president of Venezuela? I read a lot about Venezuela. I was ambassador in Paraguay for the last 3 years of your colleague Alfredo Stroessner in the beginning of whatever. What I read that people talk about golpes and coups now, and that's last century's language that I know very well. What do you think of the people that are talking about that in this hemisphere and maybe in this city now? Or is that just chatter?
Thank you.
Well, I think that with regard to the issue of Venezuela, there are two elements that are essential. Number one is the opposition. If they are going to be able to present a common road. And number two, to be very honest, what's going on within the military ranks in Venezuela. And that is something that is very difficult to discuss openly for the obvious reasons. But I do think that something also may be approached in the near future. And number three, I would say that with regard to the opposition, is going to be the most important part. And I told them, the opposition, why don't you take this as a question not of opposition versus government, but of legislative versus the executive? And to say, look, you won the 2015 National Assembly by a very large amount, and you have the same legitimacy vis-a-vis what Maduro used to have of the 2013. And you have to, it's much easier to have a problem of the legislative and the executive branch in government, like two powers, independent powers, and then to say, well, what the international community can do instead of government and opposition. And I think that if you go through this way, it may be much easier to have an intervention from abroad. A political one, I mean.
Yeah.
No? Yeah.
Very good. Listen, we could go on, but we've overextended your time already for this, and I'm deeply honored to have been with you, Mr. President. It's been a terrific hour or so with you, your presentation and response to questions, so we thank you very, very much for that. And I thank the audience for your participation as well. Thank you. Good job. Well done.
Thank you. Let me thank you, because I have the honor to have a talk with you.